warm and the muffins are still warm. So just remember that when you're doing the evaluations, that there are some good things already happening. I do want to thank Dave Spath, who has taken on chairing our group. It gives me great encouragement that we could have 9 very strong-willed, thoughtful people working together with very different viewpoints coming together. Doing the research and the work that we've done these last months gives me a lot of hope that as a community we'll be able to move forward. But I think Dave has learned what it might be like to monitor the West Bank or the DMZ and so forth. So we really appreciate that. And so hopefully there will be no tomato throwing this morning as well. Just to recap, again, in 22 minutes that the speakers, they have 20. We have a special hook at 22 that will pull them off the stage. But this is not the last opportunity. We have a lot of opportunity for Q&A. As Dave mentioned, there'll also be a follow-up opportunity to dig deeper with each of the subcommittees, and hopefully there'll be a town forum to consider all the findings as a package as well. So with that, why don't we begin? But just as a reminder, we will be circulating with index cards, and if you don't want to fill those out, we'll have an opportunity for open mic Q&A as well. But why don't I turn it over to Rick, who's going to be walking us through a fair amount of data, but we have slides, and it'll be in color up there on consolidation, laying out some of the findings if we were to go down a road of consolidating the 2 districts. So I'll turn it over to Rick. Thank you.
I think we've run out of packets, so if anyone wants to share a packet with someone else, and we can put them back for other individuals coming in. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. We on the committee really appreciate your attendance very much. So Garen's trepidation is probably pretty obvious. Last time I went through the KPPCSD financial slides at great length. Some of you may have suffered greatly because of that. And so I'm not going to go through that this time. Hold on. I will be going through, however, the slides this time, as it turns out, at a very high level for our 2 districts and a very high and comparative level. Then we're going to dive into the topic of consolidation. Take our first look. This will be the first time we've talked at all about consolidation. And our goal is to tie it all together in a fair amount of detail at our follow-up meeting in July. So we hope that as many of you will come attend in this forum in July as possible. Okay, so picking up where I left off, this is a merged view of data that I went through last time. It's been updated for the 2015 audited financials, as have a lot of the other slides. Some of the detail graphs from last time, there's an extensive array of financials that are in your packet I'm not going to go into. In some cases, I've left the 2014 breakouts with them for those of you who are interested. I think it's really important to acknowledge the efforts of Debbie Russell, who's the accountant for both districts, who basically put all these numbers together from the audited financials, and without her, none of this would have actually happened. So many thanks to her. Another thing I want to tell you about, for those of you who weren't here last time, these slides display a variant of nonlinear time, which may be disruptive to some of you. The first couple of points have 5-year gaps, and from 2006 on, you'll see this is annual linear time. So occasionally I'll compare those 2 regions. The reason for that is that I didn't want to force Debbie to go through what are sort of painfully variable audited financials for very old data, but we wanted to provide some historical context going back for the last 20 years of our 2 districts. So note that this covers KPPCSD total revenue, all sources at the top, total operating expenses, the yellowy green line there, police operating expenses, with the caveat that in the accounting, not all of the expenses, such as legal, are broken out by which part of the district they serve. and capital expenses down here. So, and I went through this in rather great detail last time as a breakout. Those slides are in your handout. This is that same plot of data, which I haven't discussed previously, for KFPD. Total revenue here, total operating expense, and the fire operating expense. Those differ only in the presence of the occasional water system improvements that KFPD funds in collaboration with East Bay Mud. So where this line jumps up over the purple line, that's the difference. And in capital, the other big difference sort of between the two districts is in capital. Excuse me. It's except for 2001, where the water system improvements were capitalized, usually they're expensed. The big drivers for the fire district, as many of you know, are the fire engine purchases that occur twice every 15 years that add up to about $1 million, and some pretty significant building improvements, some of those are here and here, that have also occurred for the public safety building. And it's a little bit difficult to capture, but there are also contributions from KPPCSD that come in to pay off part of that as well, but it doesn't really show up in this kind of context. Okay, so if you look at total operating expenses and compare them between the two districts over the last 20 years, you can see that starting in 1996, this is actually fortuitous, but they started at roughly a similar point. And from 1996 to 2006, you can see that for KFPD, this number approximately doubled. And it went up a little more slowly and consistently, although that's hard to see from this slide, from the way I've compressed time here. Excuse me. And so I'll take these apart in detail on the next slide. But this was... this happened to be the first 10 years of contracting. And so it's possible that there are some lessons to be learned from that, but this was really, we haven't gone back and dug into that at all. But 1996 was the first full year of the contract with El Cerrito. And so it may be interesting to see why those differences occurred. Now, if you do something just reasonably simple, use a very simple trend line analysis, you take the last 10 years and you just ask, well, what's the slope of the change for the two districts? You can see those lines are essentially parallel. For a $1 increment per year, the numbers are almost identical. And so really the trend line in expenses between the districts are similar since the KPPCSD police operating expenses are lower than the fire district. That constant dollar adds up to a slightly higher percentage. So this is a little over 3%. This is a little over 4% a year if you just take the simple number off the trend line slope. And actually, the fact that these changes are kind of similar, forget about the delta between them, but the fact that the changes are kind of similar sort of makes sense. These departments are essentially staffed at identical levels. They have identical issues, for the most part, to be dealing with. And so it makes sense that they're being driven by some of the same issues. I guess I didn't find this rocket science to see that that was the conclusion. And it's also true for if you just look at total operating expense, and I haven't broken this down, but if you just look at total operating expense over the last 20 years, there's not a big difference between the two districts. To the extent that expense control is in play, there's not really a difference here in how that's working. The revenue graph is a little different than the historical expense graph. They also happened to start in 1996 at about the same point. So 1996 was a year when the two districts were relatively equal. They followed fairly different paths since then. The early changes here weren't as disparate as in the OPEX changes, but fortunately this absolute dollar amount was enough to cover that strong percentage change in OPEX at the time, so it wasn't an issue at all. Let's see. So from 2006 on, in order to model this, you can't really use a simple trend line, in part because this is where Measure G came in. I talked about this a lot last time. But in your appendix, you will find the best job I can do, which has 4 trend lines, because I had to break the two districts into 2 parts. And for those of you who don't bleed easily at the sight of numbers and trend lines, feel free to take a look and if you have any questions, let me know. KPPCSD has closed the gap in terms of total revenue in the last few years, mainly due to higher rental, grant, and franchise fees. The franchise fees for waste disposal, those are heavily use restricted, but they're factored into this nevertheless. And as we discussed last time, and I'm not going to go through in any detail, but generally, in years when the property tax revenue increase is very high, the gap between these two will be more likely to grow, simply because about half of the KPPCSD revenue stream is restricted in growth from year to year to between 0 and 2%, and only about 8% of the KFPD revenue is so restricted. So 92% of the revenue for KFPD goes up at the same rate the property taxes increase, and 49% of the KPPCSD. Now, most notably, if you look at say the last 10 years, and you just add up what this difference is between the two districts, it adds up to a little over $6.1 million. So it might not be apparent, just looking at that slide, what that means, but that obviously has a lot of implications for the life of the two districts on a year-to-year basis. And so, unsurprisingly, if you just look at the total cash position of the two districts, given that they've got similar changes in operating expense, even after large expenses for building improvements and capital, KFPD shows a pretty strongly increasing total cash balance. Now, you should note this comment on use restricted. In most places, when I say use restricted, I mean based on the revenue source, there are laws governing how it's spent. Relatively little of KFPD's revenue is use restricted in that fashion. There are a zillion categories beyond that first one for how revenue can be essentially assigned in different ways, and most of the KFPD revenue is assigned in that way. And that's, I could take you through that. We could spend the entire 20 minutes on that. So that's something that we will go into next time, because it's very important, I think. So it's pretty obvious from the difference between these two graphs that KPPCSD has had a much bigger challenge. And this is why those of us who are concerned about cost containment coming to finance and board meetings, this shrinking here is evidence that KPPCSD has to do a better job of living within its means, because they're working their way into their cash reserve. However, I think what you can see is that this leads to a little bit of a double standard in how we look at our two districts, because they basically have the same expense change rates, and they're managing them at the same rate, at the same level, but they're doing it in the cost of wildly different revenue environments. And so, that's just one of the take-homes, and it's one of the things that leads into the discussion on consolidation. Okay, now I've said almost everything on this slide, so I'm not going to go through it, but at least you have the words here. The only 2 points that I really want to reiterate is that last one. This is one of the things that had implications for consolidation, and the consolidation discussion that was started, as I'll get to on the next slide. And something that I haven't really mentioned is that we as a community, forget about districts for a moment, we as a community have to deal with the fact that looming are some pretty big expenses for this building and potentially for the public safety building. And as a community, that's something that we have to start thinking about. And that also, as we'll discuss in the July meeting, that has implications both for consolidation and just, I think, for everyone who's taken the time to come in this room to think about what that means long term. Okay. So, 3 of us have been dedicated to the subject of consolidation for a while now. I was going to use the word sacrificed, but let's just say dedicated. And this is our first report, not our last one. But I'm not going to go through the following slides in detail, as has been said, but touch upon a few key points, so hang on. And if you have questions, please bring them, and if we can't get to them today, we'll talk about them in July. Okay, so we are fortunate. We have a kind of a nifty, dual-headed form of government based on special districts in Kensington. And this is a very flexible form of governance for local communities, big and small actually, but in our case it really works, I think, to our advantage. We have a fire protection district, which is given powers from the Health and Safety Code, and we have a community service district, which has all the powers of a fire protection district, Layton, as well as a list of about 30 others. It's really kind of remarkable, from police to operating airports and hydroelectric generation facilities. It's, and graffiti abatement. I mean, it spans this immense range of governance. And I'm not going to go into some of the issues with different powers. We need to talk about this later in the interest of time. But there are limitations on powers, and also many powers specifically granted that's worth talking about. So if you'll excuse me, how did this come up? I was going to say something a little different there. So historically, I'm going to explain this, but a municipal service review was conducted by our local agency formation commission. And it stated consolidation of KFPD and KCSD, that's what KPPCSD was called at the time, would streamline local government, would offer opportunities to the community in exercising greater control over the share of local. This basically, if you just walk through the financial section with me and stayed caught up, you probably get why they were bringing this up. Okay, so they originally said a lot more than this. But there was a lot of protests, particularly from KFPD, who remains, I think, unanimously opposed as individual board members to this. And so a lot of that stuff was backed out, and this was the only remnant of the discussion in the municipal service review. So LAFCO actually has the job of reviewing the effectiveness and streamlining local government. So this is their business, and they care about it pretty passionately. And so this is where the issue came up. And you will notice on this slide, and it gets worse on the following slides, that there's a lot of technical jargon and a lot of quoting of code. And so we were very fortunate to have the head of LAFCO go through and review these slides at the 11th hour and make some modifications where she thought it was necessary, but basically be able to give us something that I could go through at a high level with you and that will serve as the basis for our future discussion. One of the first things we found out in this process, everybody had been talking about consolidation. Consolidation has a lot of friends and neighbors with different names, and essentially we spent a lot of time on the consolidation path and the reorganization path. And the bottom line is that there are a lot of different paths that basically lead to the same end. The KFPD gets merged into the KPPCSD and disappears as a standalone entity. So all its responsibilities transfer, and then it's gone. It ceases to exist as a separate district. So it's interesting to think, well, what would that look like on the back end? How would a reorganized district function? And that's actually pretty clear. There'd be one board. Probably we change the name to reflect the fact that it's different. LAFCO can actually not just merge the responsibilities, but the boards, up to 9. They have to be selected from the pool of 10 board members. So we would end up with initially a larger board composed of members. LAFCO at least would have the option to do that. And then the language is there. But basically, as terms expire, the number would drift down to 5, which is the number required by code. There'll be a test on this slide shortly. So one of the questions that's brought up, and I'll get into why in a moment, is, so would the ad valorem tax revenue that now comes to KFPD transfer over to the merged district? And this was raised as a pretty serious question in the MSR proceedings. So based on the conversations with the auditor and LAFCO, it's clear that the value in the practice currently, and there are quotes from those two here, is that revenue follows along with responsibility. So if 100% of the responsibility transfers, 100% of the revenue transfers. Now, we haven't found a case where that's not true, and we have one recent case that we're going to go to in detail. But there's a reason that it's a question. There's a reason that it says here it's not an ironclad guarantee. And it's a little strange, but it's important at least to look at. So when special districts are involved, there's this little arcana. Even when the auditor says, I have to actually read this, even when the auditor says 100% of the revenue will transfer between the local agencies who are altered by the jurisdictional change. That's the KFPD and the KPPCSD. The County Board of Supervisors is supposed to negotiate the exchange on behalf of the affected districts. So when there's 2 special districts, the Board of Supervisors gets to negotiate with itself. Now, it's not actually, and even if 100% transfers, so it's not clear there's anything to negotiate. If you were transferring half the powers of a district, you'd be negotiating. In this case, it's not so clear what's negotiated. But it's not so clear where the county getting any money comes into that. And that's really what this whole question boils down to. The ambiguity is there any path for that to actually happen? And it's not clear why that's the question, but that was the question raised by the KFPD lawyer in 2009. However, there's zero possibility that the community would actually lose money, because there's a circuit breaker in the whole process. If the county and the district cannot agree, then it just doesn't go forward. The county has no leverage in the discussion. So you just say, no, thank you. We'll keep it the way it is. So that quote is from Luann right here. But the bottom line is that this is a complex thing, but not really. We don't know the answer yet, but it's a complex thing, but not really. So a lot of people, I think, are going to continue to look at that. When law is involved, I'm a scientist, as some of you know. Science deals with ambiguity gracefully. With the law, it's perhaps not so. Okay, so with everything else, it's really straightforward. One of our few slides that Luann didn't have to make any modifications to. Beyond the property tax revenue, LAFCO has the ability to just set terms and conditions and make sure everything goes smoothly. And I'm not going to go through this, but LAFCO appears to have the power to just lay down how it's going to work. And therefore, after these changes, things would be more or less like they are now. It would just be in the auspices of one district. Now, this is not to say, this is extremely easy to ensure when both districts are cooperating and on the same page. However, under the current circumstances, that's not the case. So that's not to say that some sort of legal disruption couldn't be manufactured. I mean, in the modern era, right, this is not even complex. And it's also not to say that the current contract couldn't be modified in some way to also be disruptive. So there are a number of things that are, again, uncertain in the law that I think could come into play here. But the basics are really straightforward. The one place where what you call it matters the most is in how the process begins. So the destination is the same, a merged district. But there tend to be 3 different ways to start these process. In this case, it would be KPPCSD initiates the process with or without the KFPD. Petition by not less than 10% of citizens, so citizen petition, and LAFCO initiates. So from what we know at the moment, the only one that seems to be in play for all of them is KPPCSD initiates, and whether any of the rest makes sense for various reasons that are on the slide. Actually, in certain cases, like in reorganization, probably neither of these would be desirable or appropriate. And once the process gets going, there are a number of things in play. But I think what's important, there are a lot of details here, but what's important is ultimately, unless both districts are strongly in favor, it's going to come down to the vote of an enlightened, hopefully enlightened community as to what we want to do. And I hope that your all being here is helpful in that regard. Okay, so we're not going to go through pros and cons. There are a lot of them here. We're not here to advocate for pros and cons. What we're here to do is capture a lot of voices and hand them to you. I'm happy to take questions about them. But since there are a lot of them, and since some of them connect to presentations that are going to follow, and then we'll have questions afterwards, I'm just going to leave you with these. But I hope that you can look at them and see the voices of friends and neighbors on both sides of this issue reflected reasonably. Finally, I'll just say a lot of people contributed greatly to this project. I won't go through them since I'm suffering proximity to the hook. Particularly, I want to note that Gail Feldman, Luann Texera, Gail Feldman did the first draft of the whole second half of my presentation, and Luann Texera has done an epic amount of work reviewing them. Chris, my other co-committee member, and Deborah Russell, for reasons I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rick. I didn't even have to take out the hook, so I appreciate that. Just as a quick reminder before we bring up our next speaker, again, I think Rick eloquently put it, we're capturing pros and cons, and our original charge is to provide pros and cons of various approaches, do the underlying policy analysis, but not to issue the specific recommendations. So just want to remind everyone of that. Charles, I'll give you the floor next for a presentation on contracting with another agency for police services.
Good morning, everyone. I am new to the widely reported complexities of the AV system in this room, so I would ask if any of you have difficulty hearing me that you please raise your hand and let me know, and I will endeavor to fix that. So I'm here on behalf of our three-person subcommittee on contracting for police services. I'm happy to report that our subcommittee worked cooperatively and I think, pretty well, but that will be for you guys to judge. So thank you, Mabry Benson and Tim Snyder, for getting together and working on this charge. So first, I'd like to give you a very high-level overview of the sorts of things that one could contract for should the district decide it wanted to do that. Issues that are subject to a contract, and this would be with another policing agency, of which we have spoken to 7 so far, would be the amount of coverage that is provided, the kinds of uniforms and cars that the officers wear. I know some people in the community have said to me that it's important for them to have officers wearing Kensington colors, driving Kensington marked cars. That is something that's subject to contract. That would be up to the community if it wished to do that. All of the departments we spoke with are willing and would be happy to provide services in that way if so requested. Another thing that is subject to contract is where it is located. I think there is some concern that policing not be remote from Kensington, and many people have expressed a preference to have it be in the public safety building. That would be something subject to contract. All of the departments with which we spoke said they would be happy to locate policing wherever Kensington wants it located. Another thing would be the command structure. Some people believe it's important to have a chief or someone who's clearly the highest up of the Kensington contingent, and that is something that is subject to contract as well. It could be called a chief or something else. Another thing subject to contract would be the ability to replace an unsuitable officer. What we have heard from the agencies we spoke with is if it's part of the contract that if an officer is found to be unsuitable, not to the liking of the political structure in Kensington, then that officer would be removed from duty to Kensington and put back into the general pool from which he originated. So that is also subject to contract. And then another thing, and this is just the level of services, things like vacation checks, key program, and things like that, those are all subject to contract. What kind of deal does the district wish to strike? So let's move on and talk about our limitations. What we could do was assess the willingness of other districts to contract with Kensington. We spoke with them and we have a sense of who in our immediate surrounds would be willing to talk to us about this. We could not and did not try to determine the appropriate staffing levels. We view that as being beyond our charge as a contracting committee. What we did is we showed these departments how Kensington is currently staffed and asked them to give a kind of comparison. But that would be subject to the independent evaluation either of a hired expert, such as Brown and Taylor, which the district engaged in 2009, or some other expert, or the considered judgment of the board itself. Now the next one is going to be disappointing to you, or I think to many of you, is which we cannot get detailed information on costs. Okay, I know a lot of people want to know, could we do this more cheaply? What would it cost to do? So why can't we get you this detailed information? Because we are an advisory committee. We are not engaged in a request for proposal procedure. And we have been told over and over again that we're not going to get real numbers until the district decides, as it has not decided at this point, that it actually wishes to go through this process. And I think that's axiomatic for those of us who deal with contracts as a profession, as I do, that you don't get real numbers until you actually start negotiating. We can give you some rough sense, and we will share with you the rough information that we have been furnished by the relevant agencies. So let's go through very quickly some pros and cons. A pro might be that the cost of police services is predictable over the life of the contract. If you have a contract that runs 2 years, you have a very good idea of what it's going to cost. There typically would not be any surprises. Again, that would all be subject to negotiation, but you could write a contract that way. Another pro would be that Kensington would be fully staffed even in the event of employee absences like workman's compensation or what have you, and would not have to pay extra for that. That would be built into the contract. So if one of the Kensington officers gets hurt on the job, the agency with which Kensington is contracting would send a replacement. That is the way the contract would be written. Another thing would be the shift of legal fees. I don't mean all legal fees for the district, but those arising out of alleged officer misconduct would be shifted to the agency that's responsible for them. So that is a possible pro. Another possible pro would be an access to broader services that other departments have. One of the things that Interim Chief Hart has mentioned is, well, he's called it out as a possible issue, is that we do have at times unsupervised officers where we're staffed just by a single officer who's not in a supervisory capacity. And that is not in accordance with police best practices, but that is what Kensington does. The other departments, there are always command people 24/7 that are readily accessible in our adjacent communities. That's a possibility. Body cameras, which I know is an issue in the community. Some of these departments, notably Albany, already have and have paid for substantial deployments of this. So one might be able, I'm just trying to say, to contract for things the community wants that other departments already have. A canine unit, El Cerrito has. Some people think that would be a nice thing to have. A well-trained crisis intervention team, and also more robust internal affairs capabilities. A little bit more on cons. As I hinted at, the ability to change individual officers. If there is an officer that Kensington doesn't like, then that one would be sent back and a new one would come on. Field supervision, as we've discussed. Some people believe, and this is in the policing literature, that there's greater professionalism and risk management training in larger departments. I don't want to say that that's necessarily true, but there definitely is literature out there that argues that. Another possible pro would be having human resources and admin functions outsourced to departments that already handle that in routinized ways. Economies of scale that perhaps could be achieved by a larger organization. And then the very act of contracting itself could be seen as an opportunity to restructure the size and services of the Kensington Department to accord as precisely as possible with what the community now wants in 2016 or whenever this decision is made, if indeed it is made. And now let us go to contracting cons. There are some possible startup and transition costs. One of them would be a feasibility analysis, such as the district paid for in 2009, if the district thought that that was necessary. There may be startup costs which would be charged on through the contract of a certain amount for getting new officers up to speed. We have some estimates of anywhere from $3,000 to $6,000 for that, which our report will detail more thoroughly. Another possible cost would be if Kensington were phasing out its own standalone department and instead contracting with someone else, would be possible retention pay to keep officers on service until the transition is made. Once officers hear that Kensington is shutting down, they may wish to relocate, so one might wish to provide incentive pays to keep them going. And then we have the loss of identity and the loss of control. As I said, as far as wearing Kensington uniforms and having Kensington cars that could maintain if that's what the continue if that's what the community wants. But there is some sense that some people could feel about a loss of control, that the department, we're taking on the culture of one of our neighboring communities and it's different somehow from our own. So now let's talk about continuing obligations a little bit. We have CalPERS, our CalPERS obligations is twofold. We pay a percentage of current officer salary to provide for their benefits, but we also pay a chunk towards unfunded liability. So if we were contracting out with another department, that the percentage of salary part would be part of that contract, we wouldn't pay that anymore, but we would still continue to pay for unfunded liability. The district probably could not afford to completely get rid of its obligation to CalPERS, which would mean terminating its coverage, because the estimates on that are currently $9 to $14 million. But what it could continue to do is pay, as it does right now, towards the unfunded liability every year. A 5-year average of that is about $230,000 a year. That is subject to change given various market conditions. But what's important to emphasize is this is a current obligation that the district has taken on, and it is one that will remain with the district. And contracting doesn't mean it goes away, and it certainly doesn't mean that it's added to either. It's just, it is a current obligation that would continue. Another is other post-employment benefits, which is chiefly health care, and that is currently running at about $170,000 a year. And that would continue, the district would continue to pay for the health care benefits that have vested for retirees and their families. And then this one is accrued vacation pay. This also is on the books. This is not a new liability that the district would assume. And that is over $100,000. I don't have an exact number for you, but that is vacation pay owed and already earned by current officers. This could be a one-time triggering event, not a new obligation, but an obligation to pay on a more accelerated basis. Okay, so let us move on to some of our options. The Sheriff's Department, as those of you who were here at our last presentation heard from Lisa, the Sheriff is required by law to provide some level of policing service. We're not really clear what that would be. We know at a minimum they were required to listen to reportings of crimes and respond to crimes. This is under state law. But how much coverage they would give us is difficult to assess. Would we become part of some larger beat? How often would a sheriff, drive through town? Anecdotally, we've heard sometimes, and one could analogize to other unincorporated areas, but we don't really know what that kind of coverage would be. And unfortunately, the Sheriff's Department doesn't want to talk to us about that. Because we're an advisory committee, and of course it would talk to the board about it, but not to us about it. So we can't really assess what would happen in the event that we just turned everything over to the sheriff and did nothing more. Many other areas in Kensington contract for additional services from the sheriff, notably under its Contract City program, and a couple of examples are Lafayette and Orinda. So these areas have the sheriff provide all police services. Note that is a Lafayette badge, and they are Lafayette uniforms and Lafayette cars, but everyone that you see wearing a Lafayette Police Department uniform is actually from the County Sheriff's Department and is employed by the County Sheriff pursuant to the Contract Cities program. So we just gave you some very small information about the size, how long they've been with the Sheriff's Department, how many officers they have. Okay, similarly for Orinda. How many officers, how long they've been with the sheriff. So now let's get to the city manager's perspective. We met with the city managers in both of these towns, Stephen Falk for Lafayette and Janet Keeter for Orinda. And here are some pros. They think the sheriff provides them with excellent service. They're very happy with the sheriff. They have the ability to select a new chief approximately every 3 to 5 years from among several candidates. So different candidates are brought in, and then Orinda decides which one of them they would like to see be their chief. They mentioned to us specifically the ability to get rid of problem officers. They said every now and then an officer doesn't really meld with the culture of the community, and they said it's a simple phone call to the sheriff and that officer is recalled, sent off somewhere else, and a new one comes in. They also mentioned the assumption of liability of legal expenses as being significant. And then the access to special services. The Cocoa Sheriff's Department is a large department with all kinds of different services, you know, crime lab and various other things that they are able to access. So the main con that you will hear from working with the sheriff, from people who work with them, is that it's expensive and there's no negotiating leverage. Indeed, a price list is issued by the Sheriff's Department in March of every year, which tells you what the price is for every officer of given levels. And you cannot negotiate against that, we are told. Okay, another problem is the inability to lock in costs for more than a year. The district would be subject to whatever market vicissitudes the Sheriff's Department passed on, but it would be subject equally as every other jurisdiction is, because it is a contract list. But there isn't a control past a year, it's a year contract term. Okay, so now let us move to Black Hawk, which also contracts with the Sheriff's Department. And Black Hawk is a gated community, and some have suggested it's different from ours. I've spoken with Ron Banducci, who's the head of the Homeowners Association, and also of the police district, which they have there. And he knows our area because he's a Richmond native, and he used to drive on the Arlington to get to Cal, you know, every day. And he thinks there's some similarities, but in any case, it's not for me to say whether it's similar or different. They have a different structure, and as you can see, if you look down to the a single chief, 2 deputies, and a half-time deputy. They're very happy with the sheriff. In the 30-plus years they've been using it, they've never considered going elsewhere. And note that it's a pretty lean staffing. It's 1 chief, 2 deputies, and this half-time one. They have coverage for 70% of the day, not 24/7. For the 30% where they don't have this extra coverage, then that just goes to the general pool of the sheriff's dispatch, which I think is from neighboring Danville. Longer response time, they say, but not so far an issue. They've never considered doing more than this. This is what they do. They're very happy with the sheriff, as I say, and he was very insistent that the board sets the policy for Black Hawk policing. That the board is involved and they decide what the policing priorities are. And he joked a little bit, mostly speeding and what have you. And then he also said that it's very important for them to have their chief out in the field, and that this has been something that they reached a number of years ago, and the chief spends about half of her time out in the community, and that they think that is indispensable. Now, going on to cost, we have something going in the other direction. This Oakley is a place that contracted with the city, with the sheriff for many years, but has recently decided to set up its own police department. Why did it do so? Because contracting with the sheriff, as we've heard, is expensive. And so they now are setting up their own department of 28 officers. And look what the mayor said: nothing's wrong with the sheriff's office, but they're too expensive for us. So Oakley is moving the other way, and then we have this little line about the cost per deputy in 8 years went up, over 8 years went up 50%. And the new police department, most of the people in it are actually former sheriff's deputies, which I think is further evidence that they liked the people they were getting and the service they were getting. They just thought it was too expensive to get it from the sheriff. Okay, we also contracted a number of local departments, of course. And again, we didn't really speak with the sheriff because they don't want to talk to our advisory committee. They want to talk to a community that they believe is serious about contracting and has decided that it wants to explore it. And that would be the board. The board would have to send that signal. But we did talk to a lot of adjacent departments. These 4, as we'll see, said yes, they would be interested. 2 said no, they would not. The East Bay Regional Parks District has a larger department than I would have thought, 65 officers. And then look at what the Chief of Police, Timothy Anderson, wrote to us. While I believe it would be prudent for KPD to contract out policing services at this time, the Parks District is not in a position. So it was just, they don't want to do it at this time, but maybe that could be reopened down the road. So we will leave that at that. Another department that is not interested, at least currently, in contracting with Kensington is Berkeley, another adjacent place, large department. Chief Meehan, with whom I spoke, said he believes it would deviate from the core mission, which is really Berkeley, and that the county line would make things difficult, Berkeley being in Alameda County. That isn't something we've heard from everyone, by the way, but that is something that Chief Meehan thinks. Different ticket books and what have you, the need to go to court in Martinez or Richmond as opposed to Oakland. And he said he would be willing to meet with Kensington and offered the assistance of his department in future considerations. And I know that they met with our bifurcation committee, Chief Meehan and the city manager did. So that is Berkeley. But now let's go to the yeses. These four departments all expressed enthusiasm about possibly, entering into such a relationship. That's Chief Mike McQuiston of the Albany Police Department. He's been chief there for a little less than 10 years, with the department for close to 30 years. Just a little bit of data. They have 2 beats. He sees Kensington as being a third. But again, I want to stress what that looks like as far as uniforms and cars. That's subject to contract. He doesn't mean that the Albany police wearing Albany stuff would necessarily come here unless that's what Kensington wants. He would want a 3-year commitment, again, would work to maintain the identity, and he would require that we change our dispatch contract. As many of you are aware, dispatch is now handled by Richmond. Albany has its own dispatch, and it would want that piece of it as well. So another yes is El Cerrito. That is Chief Paul Keith. He's the new chief in El Cerrito just within the last few months. Those of you who know Bob Shaner of our community, this is Bob Shaner's grandson. So he knows, he's familiar with Kensington, to put it mildly. His mother grew up here, and, he knew it as a child visiting, and he knew it as a student at Cal. So they have 3 beats. They could conceivably add a 4th. He proposes a 3-year initial commitment, and then here we have a statement about costs that he thinks he could provide it at what we now pay with a smaller force, the same amount of coverage. Thinks this is not a commitment, of course, and he would want it based out of the public safety building. And so he thinks that he could do it at a similar or lower cost. But once again, the cost stuff only comes out if the district gets serious and starts negotiating. That's when it will figure out what this actually costs. Okay? Another department that would be interested is Richmond. This is new Chief Alwyn Brown, also this year. The chiefs of Richmond and El Cerrito went off to, great jobs in Arizona, within a few months of each other, both highly regarded. So this is new Chief Alwyn Brown, with whom we met. Again, an additional beat, similar to what we've heard. The beat assignments tend to be long-term. He thinks Kensington could have the same officers for a long number of years, 5 years or more, if it wants. And he's very proud of the low turnover rate on his force, the stability of it, that the police in Richmond are happy and work well there. All right, let's move on a little bit. Garen, how am I on time? Yeah, okay. Okay, so that's not so okay. That's all right. All right, so let's move through. Margot Bennett, the chief of the UCPD. The UCPD claims it knows Kensington intimately because of its Blake Garden. They say they're here every day. I haven't really seen them here, but they insist that they are. So, and also Albany Village, it's a full-service department. They're very proud of their capability to train other departments. They say a lot of departments go to them for their expertise. They have their own rifle range and various other things. Kensington, they would want us to use UC Dispatch. They have a stress on community policing. They believe they're very well celebrated and highly regarded for that capability, and that Kensington would be either a standalone department or an additional beat. And they claim they know the area very well and are very interested in doing this. So here are some factors that will go into pricing, because I know so many of us care about that a lot. The level of police services provided, the total officer compensation. For those interested in that, you can look at the work PLG did for the MOU 6 months ago, and it shows what officer salaries are. We don't find them to hugely differ, and we think under the contracting scenario, we can't know until we decide to do this. The number of sworn officers at each level, some people say we have a top-heavy department, so that could affect the price. Ratio of civilian to sworn officer employees, division of responsibilities, etc. Finally, a last slide, there are options if the community is so inclined to explore them, and that is the takeaway. There are options if that's what the community wants. The Sheriff's Department, with whatever level of service we chose, and then 4 local departments, all of which are willing to bid for the work. And perhaps the fact that there are a number of departments bidding for it would mean to some contract leverage. So thanks, you guys. And our contracting subcommittee will be meeting in this room the morning of July 16th. Dave, I'm sure, will send out a next door notice, as he so faithfully does, and we'll get that in the Outlook as well. And so those of you who have further questions and reactions to this, please do come on July 16th. Or if you can't, just let one of us know what you're thinking, and we will definitely consider it as we put our final report together.
Thank you. You earned an extra minute because I was so enthralled with your presentation that I... the last but not least presentation next is the bifurcation of the GM, General Manager, Chief of Police position, and some of the scenarios that might around that. I'd like to invite Lisa up, and thanks very much for everyone's good attention.
Okay, thank you, Garen. How's everybody doing? One more? You ready? Okay. Okay, so we were the subcommittee that was responsible, can you hear me? This is good. We're responsible for looking at the bifurcation of the dual role General Manager, Chief of Police position. And I'd like to recognize my co-subcommittee members, David Spath, Garen Corbett, and Simon Brofman. And first thing we'll do is briefly go through the process that we employed. We looked at the basic job duties and responsibilities for the general manager and the chief of police. We interviewed 15 agencies, which I'll go into in more depth. We talked to 7 professionals and associations, professional associations in California for both general managers, city managers, and police chiefs. We met and heard from many community members about some of their concerns and information. We developed global findings with pros and cons. We have a spreadsheet which is included in your packet that goes over the detail. And one thing that I think is important about that spreadsheet is it really looked at what is the admin support for these agencies that we studied in terms of the support that they needed to be successful. And we looked at base salaries for both general manager and chief of police. We'll go over, and being visual people, we actually took a crack at organizational options that we'll get into in this presentation. So the way we organized our work was we felt it was important to separate different ways that people had their governance structure. First, we looked at the shared general manager, chief of police organizations. We talked to Kevin Hart for the Kensington KPPCSD. We also looked at Broadmoor, which is a police protection district, which has a chief, which is also the top administrator and the general manager for that. That happens to be the only police protection district in California that's a standalone. And we also talked to a fire protection district. We talked to the chief of the Rodeo Hercules Fire Protection District because we realized that there are over 300 fire protection districts in California. That chief in all those situations, no matter how large, and many of them are quite large, is also the top administrator. So that chief for a fire protection district fundamentally has the dual roles of being the top administrator as well as the chief. So we thought it'd be important to talk to that. It's not 100% apples to apples, but there are a lot of similarities. Next, we looked at agencies that had a shared GM, chief of police, in the past, and this we really focused on the city of Sutter Creek. They had a dual role position for 8 years where the chief was also the city manager for that district. We really wanted to understand, how that worked, what didn't work, and we have extensive information about that as well. We next looked at those, what we call split positions and similar services. Here we focused on community service districts that were actually had police and or fire as part of their functions and services. And the ones for the community service districts that we could find in California, Lake Shastina, Marinwood, Stallion Springs, and also we talked to Muir Beach. And we also looked at small cities that had small police services, and we wanted to compare how that worked for their police, how their police and governance structure worked. So we did talk to the city of Clayton, the city of Ross, and the city of Belvedere. And lastly, we looked at agencies, community service districts, where they had a part-time general manager, because we're really interested in how that worked as an option, as a split situation. And for those, we talked to 5 different community service districts. They're all rather small, but there was a lot of good information about what is appropriate to, when is the appropriate situation to use a part-time general manager. Lastly, we talked to the city manager of Turlock, who was, I should say, a career police chief. And actually, Turlock's had 2 city managers that have been career police chiefs in the past. So we wanted to find out what are the requirements for a chief that transitions then to that role of the lead manager. And we talked to, as Charles said, the chiefs from Berkeley and Albany. So I'm going to now go through the global findings that we had. These are sort of the things that we heard through all these interviews that came out pretty consistently. First off, the separation of the GM and the chief of police is a preferred organizational structure. Pretty much everybody we talked to felt that way, with the exception of the 3 agencies we talked to that had a dual position. But everybody else felt that that was a very important piece. Also, we learned that the span of services is critical. The more services a district has, because a district can have a variety of services, the greater the number of services, the more important it is to have a separate position. And that was really important. The issue of discipline, grievances, and investigations, everybody agreed that these required incredibly clearly defined processes, because you need to be able to separate the investigation, the recommendation, the appeals process. So everybody needed to have very clear processes and good understanding about how that worked, so that there was like the firewall between those pieces of the puzzle. And we also learned that police chiefs are often general managers or city managers for very short periods of time. That ranges anywhere from 2 months to 2 years. It's typically done when they are recruiting for a city manager in certain situations, and the police chief takes on those dual roles, but it's usually a term-limited period of time. We also looked into, most people agreed that the general manager and the chief of police, the skills and training are not necessarily the same. The general manager typically is trained in public policy, perhaps administration, finance. There's sort of a variety of areas that to be a city manager are important, or a general manager. And police chiefs are more typically trained in the command structure. They move up from the position of officer. You must be an officer to be a chief. And so they move through the ranks, and it's a different process of learning and skills. So as part of that, when you do have a dual role position, the critical factor is finding the right person who has both of those skill sets. And looking just briefly at part-time, some part-time issues, part-time general manager, some big ahas was that it really requires a clear board, goals that are clear to that general manager, as well as staff that are empowered to make decisions. And nobody recommended a part-time chief when we questioned them on that. They felt that that was not appropriate, that chief really need to be there and run the police organization. And we were also asked to look at whether a captain or a lieutenant could be the lead, and we found that that never occurred. The person who is in charge of the police department is called the chief and has the responsibility and the authority as the chief. So just quickly on this kind of concept of a part-time general manager, Clear policy and direction from the board is critical. They need good managers and administrative staff that are empowered to make decisions. The GM cannot be there all the time. Decisions have to be able to wait until the GM has time to deal with those. They are not a full-time position. They are part-time. And in the case of Kensington, they have to have a really strong knowledge of police services. If you're really looking for a general manager who can help to guide and set the culture of the police department and work with the police chief, then you need somebody who knows what those services are about. Potential challenges, we wanted to put this in here. We heard this from a variety of sources, both at the interviews, from the community, and we wanted to just acknowledge and recognize that a dual role position has challenges. There's questions about the budget development and expenditures, and is there independent oversight of those? Are the delivery of all services equitable and objective? Are the review of the disposition of grievances, discipline, and investigations, are those fairly handled and clearly, responsibly handled? There's the issue of, can the public feel free to report police issues to a dual role position if that's the same person as is overseeing the police department? There's public fear perhaps of retribution in reporting of police issues that dual role has to deal with. Is there adequate oversight of the police department? And we heard from a number of people that officers, may resent, and we didn't talk to our officers, but they may resent that the dual role position is not spending full time on police issues, that they're taken away from that and that their chief has to share their time. They may resent that. We heard that from actually a few people. And additionally, police operations are dominant, that may distract the general manager, chief of police from non-public safety issues. So again, these are concerns, challenges that we heard in that dual role environment. It's a tricky role to span. So now we're going to get into some fun, kind of fun diagrams, and we have here, I'm going to kind of focus on the organizational diagrams, and you'll have the pros and cons that I'll just mention and flip through quickly, but I'll just kind of focus on these diagrams. Typical for all the diagrams that are going to follow, where we looked at organizational structure and the bifurcation, possible bifurcation of the position. Just wanted to point out, the board is elected, as everybody knows. The board hires the general manager. That is a mandate of law. They must have a general manager. The board also hires any legal counsel that report to the board. So that is true for all of these diagrams that will follow. And what we did was we looked at 6 different organizational options, just as things to consider. One is the existing structure with the dual role. One is looking at part-time general manager with in-house police, full-time general manager. I'll be going through these, but it looks at what happens if you contract out, what happens if you consolidate. So there's a variety of options to consider, and which is why we're following these other people in these presentations in case the board wishes to consider some of these things. So first of all, I'm going to start, the first 2 slides are a little slow, but then it picks up quickly. So in our district, in the police KPPCSD organizational structure, we have the general manager, chief of police. That is one position. We have a half person who is admin support to the district. We have 3 services. That's refuse, which is by contract. We have park and rec, which is by recreation contract, and then some other park maintenance duties. And we have the police department, which is 85% of the entire budget and the scope of what the district does. So the police department is made up of 9 officers. There's a half of support staff, and then there are additional contracts in the police department, including dispatch with Richmond, some technical support, and other contracts as well. So what you have here is the service level, and here with these lighter colors are the contracts that we have. And of course here we have the bulk of the employees in the police department. So, page. So just to point out a couple of pros and cons, and these are on your slides, but I'm not going to dwell on the slide with all the text. Basically, one of the advantages of this is when you look at these services, it's primarily a police department with the bulk of it, with other services that are primarily through contracts. So when you think about it, and in fact when we talked to a lot of people who said, oh yeah, it's great to have it separated, you got to have it separated, that's the best way. When we said, well, let's explain to you that we have in our district, we have a refuse division, which is a contract, and we also have a park, which is a contract for recreation, Marty, and KCC, actually. And then we have park maintenance and building maintenance in the one park that we have. And then they would all sort of say, oh, well, yeah, I can see why you are looking at this dual role position and why you've done it, but these are the things you need to worry about. So that's kind of how the conversations pretty much went. And on the con side, I mean, I think we talked about a lot of the cons, the perception of conflict of interest between the responsibilities, including budget development. The public may be uncomfortable in reporting police-related issues. And also the con is finding the right person. I mean, finding the right person who has the expertise in both areas and can serve those well is also another a challenge. The next diagram we have is where we start to split the general manager out from the dual role position. Here we have a part-time general manager, and this scenario looks at a part-time general manager retaining the full police department. So you have a part-time general manager. We always have some admin support to the general manager. We felt that that was pretty critical, and everybody seemed to have that as well. But here you have a separate police chief. The police chief now is devoted fully to police activities. The part-time general manager oversees the services and the administrative responsibilities of managing the district. Some of the pros to this option are that the COP, the police chief can focus solely on policing to the benefit of the community and the officers. Another pro, that the general manager can serve as a buffer between the police chief, the board, and the community. And it also creates another level of oversight and a process for appeals related to the grievances, discipline, and investigations. So those are some of the big pros to this scenario of separation. The cons are, you're adding half a position, and we'll get into the costs later, but basically it has the potential to be more expensive. The part-time, just the issue on the part-time person may limit the availability of the general manager to address all of the community issues promptly. Also, another thing is that there has to be a good working relationship. You now have two top people. You have the general manager at the top, and then you have the chief, and they have to have a good working relationship. And so finding the two right people that work well together is a challenge. And again, the general manager may have limited time to attend all the community functions and meetings that may be expected by this community. The next option looks at a full-time general manager, and we retain in-house police. This is basically similar to the last slide, but the difference is you have a full-time general manager. So now this person has more time. More time to be with the community and attend more meetings and events, be more of a liaison with adjacent agencies in the county, be a resource to the district in terms of research and documentation. And they really have the opportunity to undertake more activities that are presently being carried out by consultants, perhaps, and replace those costs by board members and by committees like ours. But they do have more time. So if there's a need for a strong face of the community that needs to be here all the time, 24/7, then you're really talking about a full-time general manager. And the disadvantages, of course, are that it, again, can potentially add cost and could be more expensive. And another con is that, the district services may not sufficiently require a full-time position just for the district functions. The fourth scenario of options looks at a part-time general manager and contracting out police services. So if the board were to look at contracting out police services, you now have a situation where you have most of your services contracted out. Perhaps a part-time general manager here is able to oversee and negotiate those contracts and take care of the admin for the district as well as the additional park facilities piece, and it greatly simplifies the work of the general manager because they don't have all the staff. The pros are that the administrative workload, may not be huge, and so that's a good thing for a part-time position. And the cons, there are no cons because you must have a general manager. We now no longer have a police chief because the police chief is with another agency, so there are no literally bifurcation issues to resolve. It just automatically separates the positions, and that issue goes away. The next diagram looks at consolidation. It looks at consolidation related, it looks at full-time general manager when you add the consolidation, the possible consolidation of the fire district. And the fire district has the El Cerrito contract, which our subcommittee never questioned. We always assumed that it was working well and it would stay there for a long, long time. So, but here you do have your whole police force as well, and you have another additional service. So what you have here is a need for a general manager just because of the addition of all those services. You do need a full-time general manager. And the last diagram that we're looking at is consolidation with Fire Protection District, where you contract both services. And here you can see that there's primarily contracts for all of the primary services. A full-time general manager, we were back and forth whether it's full-time, part-time. Because of the additional services, we felt it was important, because of the span of those services, to move forward with a full-time general manager. There's a lot of contract negotiation overseeing those contracts. There's a lot of work that's remaining to be done, and the advantage is having the person to do that with the time to do that. And then there are, again, no disadvantages because there is no chief, so you don't have to bifurcate a position. You're forced to do that. Okay, the last two slides, basically we wanted to share with you some salary information just to give you an idea of what things cost. I want to point out this is base salary. There are no benefits at all included in these. All these costs would escalate with any benefits. But of those agencies we studied, and with the caveat that these may not be the agencies in our local area, some of these are in very remote areas, but for the areas that we studied that I mentioned at the beginning, the dual position general manager COP for the agencies we studied was from $145,000 to $236,000, no benefits. Part-time managers ranged from like $63,000 to $197,000, $100,000. Full-time managers were $95,000 to $200,000, and the police chief's salaries ranged from $61,000 to $147,000, $148,000. Oops. Oh, yeah, I made the point. Agencies not studied do not necessarily reflect Bay Area salaries. So we talked about that. But thank you. I'll repeat that. It's an important point. Just to close, in summary, the addition of a separate general manager position means that either you need to balance the existing budget by reducing other existing expenditures and or services. So there's an opportunity to try to get that additional money out of the system that you already have, or it's by increasing the budget to add a new position and finding new funding to support the position of the general manager, possibly through additional taxes. So, and I wanted to point out that that's kind of the takeaway for this, but basically retired general managers or chief of police without benefits, were you able to set up systems, and we did study and hear about systems that might work without benefits, could minimize the impact of some of the expenditures. And that is it. Thank you.
I can confirm that the temperature in here is probably in the low 80s, so if I was personally concerned that I was experiencing a hot flash, but apparently it really is warm in here because I've confirmed by looking at other people who are sweating. So we are going to, so first let's just give a round of applause for all three presenters and the teams. So now the fun part. We have a couple of questions, but just as a reminder, if you don't have any cards and you have some questions, we have pens and cards that we can pass around. So I have a couple of advanced questions that came up quickly. It looks like we have so far, I think, 30 cards that are about to come my way. So I'll start with, what's that? There's more cards. Okay, so we have a lot of cards. I will start with a question so Rick can start answering this one. Rick, do you want to come up or have a microphone? The first question, and then I'll begin sorting through some of these questions. A member of the audience asked, did the total expenses for the Kensington Fire Department include legal cost and settlements? And I saw some wireless headphone microphones. There we go. Yeah, no.
Sorry, for some reason my voice gave out at the very end of my presentation, so I'm normally I don't need mere technological devices to answer questions. Oh, here, hold on. So the question was, did total expenses include legal expenses, correct? And the answer is yes. The details are in your appendix for the legal expenses through 2015. So as far as I know, you can't hide from the auditors. In the audited financials, those expenses are all captured.
And Rick, could you follow up? There was a question also about was the fire district included in any of the subcommittee research meetings, and if not, could you explain?
Yes, so a few months ago I went to the fire district, and because of Brown Act issues, in order to talk to us, we had to agendize it. So I went and I said, hey, how would you guys like to talk with us? And they said, they thought about it for a while. And eventually I got a response back saying, we'd like questions submitted in writing. And we had sort of invited them to committee meetings, but they wanted questions in writing. We hope to get responses in writing. So then I attended a fire board meeting where the answers to those questions and basically anything else that the fire district wanted to contribute to the discussion went on. It was about a 45-minute discussion, ran quite a bit over its agendized time. And that, if it's not already on the fire district website, for those of you who'd like to hear that, it's worth listening to the three. We asked three specific questions, the first two of which were kind of, tell us what you'd like us to know and can you provide any information and data in writing. And the last one was about budget projections. Which we're hoping, as I think you know from last time, to put together not just the backward to today, but the what does this mean going forward, and be able to sum it all up at the end. And initially the fire district committed to, we just wanted the OpEx budget so we could compare with the MOU. The fire district committed to working on budget projections at the next finance committee meeting, but after that they changed their mind and said, well, we can't do it because we're thinking about the public safety building. So we've had a lot of interaction with them. It's sort of, I think we're hoping that in the July meeting that they might appoint someone to come and engage in a discussion. In our July meeting, we're hoping to also have LAFCO. That's actually, the head of LAFCO will come, and so many people will be able to ask questions. And you know, broad participation from people like perhaps the firefighters union might also be something we can arrange. So we're trying to get a lot of input from a lot of people.
And Chris has a quick follow-up.
We didn't get their feedback on the presentation today. We had a democratic debate and decided not to do it, so probably put it the most diplomatic way. We do hope to get their feedback before we present the next item, and we were talking at the last meeting about possibly inviting them to a ad hoc committee meeting so we can really discuss the issues, and because I think their input is important, it affects them greatly. So we do hope to get their input before the final report is released.
Let me just add, too. The fire board is going to be meeting next week. I plan to go over there and ask the fire board if they would be interested in having a joint meeting of the committee and the fire board. Hopefully they will be willing to meet, recognizing that it would probably have to be a Brown Act meeting, but I think that can be accommodated. So yes, we're more than willing to sit down and talk in detail about the issues.
Great question. One question, is there's still a microphone over there? Okay, great. For Charles, there was a question about how quickly could perhaps KPPCSD solicit, review, select, and implement a contracted out police force. And there was a related question about what is the process to initiate such a contracting out process, board decision, would there be a community vote required, et cetera?
How quickly, I don't have a precise answer for that. I think to go through the contracting process would probably be a matter of months. And then there would be some sort of lead time, for the transition that would be built into it. It's not something that could happen overnight. It would happen through deliberation, but I don't really have a good answer for that. But I think it could be accomplished if there's a community will to do it in under a year's time, and then the time frame could be set, farther out if so desired. And Garen, was there another component to that as well?
I think that got the bulk.
Community approval, was it?
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the community approval process.
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I can't really answer that. I mean, I know there was an initiative on the books, or still is an initiative on the books, that suggests that it has to be put to the community's vote. But I also understand, and people with more and direct knowledge of this should certainly speak to this, that council advised and was asked for an opinion on the legality of that, and advised that it probably would not survive a legal challenge. But to my knowledge, that has not been repealed. So I think there is some sort of ordinance on the books, but requiring public approval. But the status of that is very much in question in light of the opinion of council. And, again, my understanding is it hasn't been repealed, but we've been advised that it need not be put to public vote, but that it is a political decision for the elected representatives of the community to make.
Great. For some reason, this question is addressed to me, but I think the entire subcommittee can help, ad hoc committee could help answer. There's a good question about what real guarantees would Kensington have that another agency would provide personnel in case of short staffing if there are no officers available. Why would another agency put Kensington's needs before its own in a real crisis? And so I'll take a stab at that, but I think it's an excellent question that sort of speaks to the strength of a contract provision, the strength of a department. If another department were contracted, what's the strength of that in terms of their excess capacity, spare capacity, commitment, performance, and so forth? I've managed a lot of public contracts over my career, and I could say that performance measures, money sometimes talks, as well as goodwill, but there's also things like, just like our fire department, there's local aid and contingencies where communities help each other out in a real crisis. I could imagine such a scenario occurring as it does now, just like our police sometimes helps out El Cerrito now and vice versa when there's coverage issues or a crisis. So I think it's a great question. I don't know if one can ever get to 100% fail-safe, but a lot of organizations do a lot of contracting out in partnerships, and you build contractual relationships with terms that strongly incentivize and encourage adherence to the best terms that are agreed upon. Does anyone else want to take a stab at that? Good. Okay. It's fun. Not only am I sorting cards, I get to answer one, so that's fun. So there's some questions, a good number of questions, which I'm trying to sort on the fly here, but there's a question about are Kensington and Broadmoor, and Lisa, I think this one's for you. Are Kensington and Broadmoor the only two police districts with combined GM, CO, Chief of Police roles in the state?
Broadmoor is the only standalone police protection district in the state, to our research and knowledge. And Kensington is the only community service district that has police services that has the dual role that we were able to identify.
Great, thank you. And of the 300 or so fire districts in the state, how many have combined roles?
Well, our understanding in talking, when I spoke with the Fire District Association of California, basically they said that the chief is the top administrator for every fire protection district. So as far as our information led us to believe, they are, unless a fire district is part of a community service district, where there is a general manager and then there's a separate chief, but standalone fire protection districts, as far as we know, all have the chief as the top chief and a top administrator, reporting directly to the board.
Great. There was a follow-up question about if we were to consolidate the police and fire, would the police continue to only patrol the Kensington area, except for, of course, in emergencies? I believe the answer is yes. If contracting out, would Kensington Police only patrol Kensington except for emergencies? Would we have our own police station building as we have now? And I think some of those points were covered in terms of, you know, a lot of those options Charles laid out of if you lay those out in the contract, then and the other party agrees, then those would occur. There was also a question that came up regarding, there was a little bit of a, controversy is a strong word, concern of a couple of slides that Chris Deppe had prepared that a little bit at the last minute that the committee as a whole agreed that would certainly go into the appendix and in the next meeting, but weren't included in today's presentation. It was another look at comparing the revenues of the police and fire. So I just want to say that this was not one person, but it was the whole group sort of trying to balance the fact that we had presentations and materials that had to go into production and not an attempt to shut anyone out of the process. Oh, another one, okay. Okay, great. So we're rolling. How's everyone doing? All right. So here's a LAFCO question, not a laughing matter, but a LAFCO question. Is it true that LAFCO favors consolidation of unincorporated communities into adjacent incorporated ones? So, you know, the question of, you know, are there some disadvantages of having unincorporated areas? If this were true, would any of the proposed changes trigger such an action by LAFCO or encouragement? Would voters have to approve any further consolidation out of an unincorporated area? And I guess, you know, this is a real concern among members of the community that I have heard. Any chance that we would then sort of be pushed into merging with either the city of Albany and its school district, which is, or one of the other neighboring communities. So, you know, a legitimate concern of would such, you know, contracting out for services lower the path or, you know, for consolidation into another community. Anyone want to try to take that one up?
Okay, you came into that a couple of different ways. Let me see if I can make it simple. Consolidation of fire and police services in Kensington and the potential for incorporation, I don't think have anything to do with one another. Consolidation and incorporation are wildly, wildly, wildly different. So I think those two things are disparate. Then you talked about contracting, and so for instance, another way maybe to rephrase that is if we were contracting police and fire services with El Cerrito, would we all of a sudden look like we were just part of El Cerrito and maybe we should be incorporated? And I don't think incorporation even remotely works in a way such that even if we were contracting, it would have any effect on that discussion or provide any leeway. And I don't think LAFCO has, well, I would be surprised based on what I have read as a chemist and a non-lawyer if LAFCO would be compelled to any action by any of those factors that would result in them wanting to push an incorporation of Kensington with anything else. So I hope that addresses what I got in those questions. I think the answer is just no, but ask a follow-up if you want.
Thank you. Another question that includes whether or not contracting out any of our services or consolidating districts, how might any rebuilding of the public safety building be impacted or affected? And I think the short answer is the police community services district well, actually, that is, who owns the building, I guess, is the first question. As a reminder. The fire does. So I would assume that any liability for that building and assets, if it were merged or remains as a standalone district, would continue to be carried by either a combined district or the fire district independently. But it's a great question. Thank you. So this
Sorry,
is
there is one issue though. If this building had to get ripped down, which I have not heard proposed by anyone, and they haven't gotten that far with the public safety building, but at some point the costs become just more than a district can afford. And at that point you have to float a bond. The issue for consolidation, of course, is you can float one bond as a merged district to deal with your building issues versus the two districts separately floating two bonds. And that was, I probably didn't make that clear because I was going like a bat out of hell. But that's one place where consolidation kind of factors into the long-term structural changes in terms of buildings that we might need to address. I'm not sure that it's a pro or a con. It's just a thing as we, as a community, get our arms around what those costs are. How does that factor into this discussion? It definitely factors in, but it's just something to consider.
Great. And Rick, since you still had a microphone, there was a question about whether or not in the expenses on the fire district side that included the water line upgrades.
That was under contained in the line with WSI, so with water system improvements, and I tried to point that out as we went. But in the total expense lines, you'll see there's two lines. One of them is with water system improvements, and one of them is not. And that number is added up. To date, I think it's about $1.5 million. I think it's projected to be about $2.2 million in aggregate costs since 1996.
So the next question, I think, is perhaps a philosophical one, but it's a good one. Why would we consider consolidation when the fire district is against it? Seemingly, the community is happy with the fire district as is. And I think that's an interesting question. I think the question is ultimately, despite whatever one board, I think community will. I certainly think the process of considering options is one that is open to the community regardless of how any one board sees it. But I think our charge was, laid out to consider pros and cons of a variety of these scenarios, and that is what we've done. Whether or not the community arrives to the decision of leaving things as is up to the community. But I certainly don't think just because one board is currently against something doesn't mean that the community shouldn't consider it. Does anyone else have anything to add to that? No? Okay. In terms of, let's see, some of these questions are very multifaceted and it is hard to split them out. But there was a question, Lisa, I think this goes to you. Did we consider in bifurcation mode in terms of staffing, whether or not if there was one combined board, a standalone GM, a police chief, and a fire chief standalone under one district, and potentially, did we see any scenarios where there were a combined fire and police chief?
Let's see. That is a complicated question. We did not look at a sort of taking apart the existing fire contract with El Cerritos, so we wouldn't have our own chief unless we dissolved that and had our own fire department staff, just like we have our own police chief with our police staff. So we did not consider that as an option. That's, I think, part of the question. And there was another part.
So there was a part of whether or not if you had in a potential consolidated, whether a shared police chief and fire chief or as standalone positions
Okay. Yep.
or combined?
Okay, so the issue of a shared, what's called in some organizations a public safety function with one chief and everybody in a under one chief's. And there was one community, I can't remember what it was, that had a chief. Maybe David, do you remember? But they had a all the fire and police wore the same uniform. For a while, and they had this for a little while, and they actually moved away from that. And the reasons that we heard, it wasn't one of our study cities, but the reasons that we heard were that fire and police are totally different disciplines, totally different training. They both have command structures, but that situation is quite rare to have a public safety division that's under one chief. So we did not look at that as an option. It was not recommended by anyone.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Here's another question, and Lisa, since you have the floor. The last slide, which I know was of salary ranges, which were of the communities that we had interviewed, not necessarily of the Bay Area. I know I made that point, but this slide, this question refers to, showed a maximum cost for a part-time manager of $97,000 a year, full-time chief of police for, I think, $148,000, and a combined GM COP of $236,000. It looks like we could get a part-time GM and a full-time chief of police for the same cost as one full-time GM COP. Any comments?
To be determined until you interview and advertise for those jobs. I mean, one of the things we did learn, and some of the research really held up to this, is that if you want a city manager or a general manager who's very experienced, those costs can be very high. To have a seasoned professional who does have that experience and a broad breadth of that experience, those costs can be extremely high. In circumstances where those costs were low, in many of the special community service districts that we looked at, they were people who really were transitioning from other kinds of work. One person was an architect, one person had worked for the county in the water department. So you're really talking about people who are learning at those lower levels, but if you really want a skilled person, that's going to really cost a lot more.
Great. So we'll take a few more of the cards, and then we'll open it up to the audience with the microphones. Lisa, there was a question from an audience member about, we noted the potential perceptions of conflict of interest in, I think, quotes, the audience member sort of says, the global finding clearly states that separation is preferred in terms of the GM COP roles and recommended best practices. You want to sort of explain our sort of balancing act of putting those quotes in there?
Yeah, I mean, the conflict of interest issue is, some people call it conflict of interest, some people call it challenges, some people call it organization. Whether there's an actual conflict of interest where somebody is personally gaining by being in the dual role, I don't think anybody actually ever stated. Mostly people said that there's a perception, that there's a potential, that you needed clear. It mostly came up in discipline and grievances, that you needed clear separation between those actions so that you'd have a clear process. So we were toying with these words. Conflict of interest has sort of a legal and personal gain factor to it, which wasn't what was represented. It was more really on the area of perceptions and believability and challenges and questioning when those dual roles were in place. But I think only one person we talked to actually said used those words, and we actually asked people flat out, what do you see the conflict of interest? Do you see a conflict of interest? And everybody mostly went straight to, it's better to have oversight, it's, good to have another level of decision making, it's good to have perspective, it's good to have more person who's more community focused. Those were the things that came out, not really conflict of interest per se issues. David, do you have anything to add to that from our?
No, I think that's correct. I mean, when we talked about conflict of interest, it was on a legal footing, and yet we know that there is a lot of perception of conflict of interest, and that, as you pointed out, that sort of resonates in the area of dealing with grievances, discipline, a clear process. Also, it was raised, what about a budget process? What if a combined position, the combined position person may have a bias towards more police services, paying for more things in the police area and at the expense of other activities. So that's sort of, it was also framed that way. But that's not, we didn't view that as a conflict of interest, but it certainly was a challenge in trying to be a balanced and objective manager.
Okay, take one or two last questions here and then again opening up to the floor. I think this is an important one. I've seen several comments similar to this. Rumors have circulated that consolidation would compromise the El Cerrito fire contract and potentially could put El Cerrito fighters' jobs at risk. Is this true? You guys want to take that one on?
Absolutely true that rumors have circulated.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this issue came up because basically the fire district goes away. I had a slide that addressed this issue about transfer of contracts. And the real question is how much play is in that. So we put that down and Luann referred to it. I think some people's default stance is, well, if the fire district's dissolved, the contract is null and void. I think by default, it's very unlikely for that to be true, but part of my commentary on that slide is if somebody wanted to try and make that true, it might be possible. But if you look at the statute, and Luann confirmed this by pointing us to specific code, it's very clear. And in the example that we just got background on Crockett, they transfer all the contracts. And they have the power to do it, and they set that term, and they just transfer all the contracts to the successor district. The law language, even for a lay person, is really clear. We have the sections referred to in here. I invite you all to read it. Contact me if you'd like me to send you the code. However, this is law, and as I said, if someone wanted to help that process along, I imagine it would be possible. Again, because it's law, I'm not sure we can say it's guaranteed. You can say, I mean, so you can take, it might or might not be guaranteed to mean we know nothing. And that, in fact, has been articulated in that position. We really just don't know. I think it would be an unlikely interpretation of the language, but I can say that easily because I'm a chemist, not a lawyer. So I'm not bound by the strictures of a lawyer. So that's my comment on it. Stay tuned. I'm quite sure that there's going to be more study by LAFCO on that subject, and Luann hopefully will be at our July meeting to address that exact issue.
Great. Okay, the last question.
We have actually a specific question out to Luann about this, so hopefully we'll know, get any of the remaining unknowns resolved before the next meeting.
Okay. Last question I think is a good segue. Does the community intend to ever, the committee, intend to ever survey the community's leanings or opinions on the various options that we were charged with looking at? No surveys have been undertaken asking an opinion. Certainly our work in trying to at least even survey what the community holds as important functions of existing services was perhaps fraught with a little bit of controversy. I do think it's very, very important, and we're certainly encouraging the KPPCSD board perhaps to partner with us in a town forum when we release our report and really allow people to dive into that. We certainly, another option at that point also may be a scientifically valid survey of the community once those findings have been released to the community and so forth. So I think it's a very good point that this is not the last word on this, and this is us taking our pros and cons in research and handing it to the community to engage in the next step of the process. And it is really important, whatever that next step is. So why don't we open it up? I see a question right there. And
hi, I'm Donna Stanton. here in Kensington, and since you didn't read my comment, I wanted to bring it up. I commend you all for the work you're doing as the task force. My concern is that it has to go back to the KPPCSD, whatever board, and you know, are you going to have specific recommendations, and then what are they going to do with them? And are we as citizens of Kensington going to have any ability to provide our feedback, not just surveys, but would it become a vote from us and not just a matter of the 5 directors making their decision, which usually ends up 3 against 2. So I really want to know that something's going to happen and that we're not just, you guys are not just doing this and then it goes nowhere. So that's my concern. Thank you.
I don't think we can answer it other than to say thank you. Sure.
That's going to happen and not just have them go through this tremendous exercise that is so important.
No, let me just, I mean, you have pointed out actually what should happen, and that should be that we finish our product. It's provided as required. We have a set of findings. We have a set of pros and cons. It goes to the board, and they review it, and hopefully they will share it with the community. Let me just say, we have no control over the board. We are just asked to complete this product. And
but really, we do strongly encourage there being a town forum, and I think that could be a good opportunity. I mean, I think all of us who are, you know, and the fact that so many of you are here today shows a level of community engagement, a lot of opinions. I don't think any of the directors, some of whom are here, are not aware of that. So I think your point is a valid one.
I have a little bit of history on that. Certainly on the issue of consolidation, the people do have a very specific right to approve or disapprove because it's part of the LAFCO process of consolidation of districts. That's actually happened with the Steege Sanitary District 30 years ago. And the people of Kensington disapproved the consolidation of the Steege Sanitary District into the city of El Cerrito. So the move, which was proposed and backed by the Steege Sanitary District Board, was defeated by the voters of Kensington.
I see a hand. Celia?
I'd like to know whether the ad hoc committee tried to find out the level of satisfaction in the general community, so satisfaction with the way the police board or police department operates and with the way the fire district operates. And secondly, was there any effort made to find out the number of internal affairs investigations or complaints that have been made to the fire board and also to the fire district and to the police district? I think that would be very telling.
Don't let any of the subcommittee members rush to the microphone all at once.
No, I mean, the simple answer is no, we didn't. And I don't think any of the committee members felt it was part of our charge to necessarily at least do the latter in particular. And as far as satisfaction of the community, I mean, we made some effort with this recent survey of trying to find out at least what services the community most desires. That was part of our requirement. But I don't think we viewed some of the other issues that you raised as part of our task.
Great.
Chris Hafner. I am wondering, in your analysis of the bifurcation of the roles and the case where you address a full-time GM, general manager, if you ever thought about, if you had a very skilled general manager full-time, would that offset what is currently the escalating cost of legal fees in basically assuming the governance role in our community, or the role of a governing entity in decision making? Is that part of the equation, or not? And would you consider making it part of the equation?
Well, you know, we would hope that that would be true, but we really don't know. Depending on what the legal issues are that arise in the community, depending on, you know, certainly the general managers are not typically lawyers themselves, so they wouldn't be able to provide that service, but it's really the level of issues that come up and what the board, you know, whether the board feels they need to hire legal expertise to defend themselves or to investigate certain issues. So there's no way, the simple answer is there's no way of knowing whether those costs would go away. I think everybody hopes those costs will go away, even now. So, you know, but there's no way of knowing.
And I think we were trying to be fair in considering that also if you had, since there were so many uncertainties, I mean, if you have a more additional senior management with a risk management skill set, potentially you could avoid some potential legal costs or personnel difficulties, certainly look at more compliance and so forth. Similarly, though, you could say the same if you were contracting with a larger agency that also had more of that infrastructure. So we were trying to maintain a voice of neutrality throughout.
So if the current police, excuse me, if we contract with an outside police department, what is,
we got a cough drop right there if you want.
what is the likelihood that the current officers will be assumed by the new department, or you know, or do we have to compensate them? What will be the outcome?
I'm happy to open up to the committee, but I would say that we have examples in talking to other communities who went through some of these processes where sometimes, like when they pulled back, I think it was Arinda from the sheriff's department, a number of those deputies rolled into the new department. I would say that it's possible, and a lot of factors would be at play. But you guys want to expand on that?
Yeah, if I could just add, we did ask that question specifically of all the departments that we were in contact with. And they said uniformly that all of Kensington's officers who wished to stay on would need to apply and go through the normal HR protocols of being approved as an officer in that department. As far as what would be owing to them, you know, I said in the presentation they're owed the accrued vacation time, and that's it. Once the contract expires, you know, our understanding, and this would be subject to confirmation by district council, is that nothing else would be owed to them. Yeah.
Barbara Perkins, I think your work has been superb. My question came up from a comment from the audience. What were the results of the police survey we took?
The survey was closed the 30th of May, and Barbie? Oh, we're not that good yet. And Simon and Tim are the principals in putting together the results of that survey, and we'll eventually get them out.
Simon, hold on. Chris, step in.
Hi, my name is Catherine Mercurio. I have a couple of questions, and again, this is about process. First of all, you mentioned that there were going to be some subcommittee follow-up meetings, and a date was given for one of them of July 16th, wondering what the other two are, and again, what the purpose of those meetings are, and specifically what you're hoping to achieve from them. And I'm hearing that there may or may not be a town hall meeting. What exactly is the status? Has it been scheduled? What's the purpose of it? What are you hoping to glean from it? Again, trying to get an understanding of process here. Thank you.
Great questions. I'll ask each of the leads for the subcommittees to iterate the dates and purpose for the follow-up meetings, and then we'll try to take back that last part of that.
So we're on the consolidation subcommittee. We're trying to schedule a meeting in July subject to Luann Texera's availability. So our #1 goal is to get a representative from LAFCO. There would only be 2 possible, so Luann probably, to come. And so we just haven't got a date yet. And our goal, I think I said, is sort of to tie financial and procedural aspects of consolidation together and just make the whole thing a little more substantive and real. I jokingly said when I started the whole financial exercise, and I didn't mention it today, but there's a giant Excel spreadsheet that has all of this data that will be part of our mitzvah to the community. I've worked on this for about a year, and the goal is that every year for both districts this will be updated, and that will be how we look at our district financials separately or not. Well, we didn't want that to stop just at a current year. What we wanted to do is be able to get to budget projections forward so that you could then, if you were lucky, you could actually say for the 2 districts, well, draw a line under all of it and say this is what a consolidated district would have looked like. And this is based on projection what the OPEX for a consolidated district would look like going forward, not just as an exercise, right? It's easy to do with the historicals. So one of the things we want to accomplish is just to give that to the community, its context.
For the committee that's looking at bifurcation, and I forgot to say this, but we do have a firm date. It's June 13th. That's a Monday at 7 o'clock. June 13th, right here in this building. And we hope to go through more detail, answer more questions. All of our interviews that we conducted with everybody and will be online in advance of that so that all questions can be answered. They're already there. They're already up online so that people can look at some of the detail research behind some of the information today. And just on the issue of next steps, at the last meeting of the committee, we talked about not only having our subcommittee individual kind of detailed discussions for those who are really interested, and hopefully a lot of people will be, but also, about a presentation or a joint meeting with the board for a kind of a final presentation of all the work of the committee, which I think is a really good opportunity for people to come and speak, and hopefully the board, certainly we'd like to present to the board as a committee, and hopefully the board will agree with that, and that would be a good opportunity for at least some initial public interaction and feedback. So hopefully that will happen sometime summer, fall.
Because, our goal is to turn in our report at the end of August or beginning of September, so to give you a timeline.
So, as we announced, the contracting subcommittee will meet here Saturday, July 16th in the morning, I believe at 9:30. And we're just interested in community reaction. We'd love to hear what we have screwed up and how we're not thinking about this straight. So anyone who wants to, set us straight and have an influence on the final report, please come to that meeting if you're available, or get in touch with any of the 3 of us if you're not.
Let me just add that I will be posting each of these meetings on our webpage. I'll do it on Nextdoor. Those are the 2 main vehicles, because the Outlook only is once a month, and we have to get our column in at a time. That makes it a little bit more difficult. So if you want to just look at our webpage periodically, you should be able to catch the agendized meeting and date. And Nextdoor, of course, those who participate in Nextdoor will also see it.
So again, I don't think I heard the answer to one of the questions, which is there going to be a town meeting?
Right. Right, so I think the ad hoc committee is saying that we would be very happy and hope that the KPPCSD board wishes to have a special town forum where they can hear our presentation and engage in a discussion with the community. That is sort of the point of handoff, and we just this week asked our chair to approach the district board with that request. It has only been 3 days, but I think it's I encourage everyone who thinks that that's an important thing to keep saying that.
And let me just add, we are obligated to have one last public forum. We can either do that and then pass the report on and have a town meeting, or it can be combined. I mean, that certainly is up to the board. And I would encourage them to have a combined meeting, town hall meeting as such, at a convenient time when everybody can attend.
Sir. Question. First, thank you for the really fine work that you've done. I'm very impressed by the professionality of this group of volunteers. My question is that the consolidation issue seems to be continually framed in terms of equity, the equity of the distribution of our tax dollars. I'm wondering to what extent the committee has considered the possibility that the threats that each of our two districts intend to deal with may not be equitable, that in fact the threats that the fire district is dealing with may be far greater than the threats that our police district must deal with, and that equitability may not be the primary value which we should consider in looking at that issue.
It's a really good question. I think one of the biggest challenges in this discussion, which we talked, thank you for asking that question, which we talked about last time, was you can have a numbers-based discussion. Numbers are pretty straightforward, facts. And you can have a values-based discussion. And equitable, as I think you legitimately meant it, how should it be? And why should it be the same or different? That's a values-based decision. And I think you legitimately mean it that way, not that one is necessarily more expensive. I think the numbers show it's not actually more expensive, and the expense trends aren't the issue. And people have played with numbers to make one political point or another political point. And part of my hope in this is that these are the numbers. They are. But the values-based discussion has got to happen in this community. And if you provide the numbers and say, okay, we don't have to worry about the numbers, they just are. But we are not even having a values-based discussion. We're pretending to have it wrapped around numbers and criticism. But what we really need to do is say, how do we want things to work? What is the value with which we want to approach looking at our districts? I think that we move to a completely different place, and I think it is the central problem of this entire discussion. So the numbers are, you can look at the numbers and make your own conclusions. But the values, we have to discuss, and I actually believe this community shares many more values than it looks like most of the time. But we've been hiding behind everybody's faux numbers and avoiding the values-based discussion or making them a surrogate. So I really hope as part of this, when we get to the end, we have the values-based discussion right out front and say it for what it is. Some of our cons to the idea of consolidation are really values-based cons. Well, okay, let's have that discussion in the realm of values. So I launched into this speech last time, I apologize, but I think it's really important. I think it's central.
I would just like to say that from approaching this, this is just my personal, as a committee member, opinion, I have been approaching this whole discussion of consolidation, bifurcation, et cetera, with thinking in the context of Kensington has a need for services, and we have available resources. And we should think of it in a holistic context of doing the best job we can with the resources we have to provide the services we need. And I think that every member of this committee has been very open to having a similar mindset, although I can't speak for them specifically. But I would continue to say that, I think, is the path that we need to continue on.
Hi. Couple of things just to follow on what you said about values and the approach to the discussion. I can say in my own experience in the time I've lived in Kensington since moving here in 2008, I never really once heard, and after looking at the the services and the budgets related to the two districts, the question of who's providing the best value or service the issue of the fire department has never crossed my mind. So just that's my own personal experience. And I was kind of curious about what's missing from the need to tie the process and the financials to the consolidation issue, because I think everything is available publicly for the fire department's budget, and they're fairly, completely transparent in my experience. And a lot of the agencies on the bifurcation side, or rather the contracting side, were pretty clear that there's a point at which you don't have to, getting into very specific conversations when there's not a decision made is, kind of for limited time and resources can be not necessarily the best option for. So for example, why should the fire board and the fire district go an extra mile and provide things that I thought there's pretty much everything's available. So I'm not sure what's not available, because there's a lot of insinuation that the fire board is not cooperating in some way. And all the other agencies that we approached for contracting said, when this is done, we'll start talking about that. So I'm kind of curious as to, what's missing that you don't seem to have.
Everyone stumped by that?
Goal is not to be missing anything in the final analysis. That's why we got the audited financials. It's the only way you can compare apples to apples. So I'm doing a bad job if it is. So I'm hoping that that's not true. I guess is something missing.
Well, I don't think financially. I don't know if you're talking about that. I think there are the issues that has been brought up. Are the cultures compatible? What would the two districts or two departments be like if they're under one organizational structure? And that's something we didn't look at. The two areas really were the financials, and I think, like you say, that's public, so anyone could have created the charts, although there was a lot of work creating those things, so I'm not sure anyone would have done it. But how consolidation works was one of the things that we spent a lot of time on that I didn't even understand before we started. So I think that is something that not everybody could have gotten, at least very easily. So why is it called reorganization instead of consolidation? Who can initiate it? What are the rules regarding it? So I think for that, there is a lot of information that we've given out that wouldn't have been impossible, but would have taken a lot of time. And we had the benefit of Luann at LAFCO answering question after question after question. I'm not sure if she would do that for just anybody, or spend that much time with anybody in the public. So I'm hoping that at least there we've given information that wouldn't have been readily available and have provided some illumination in that sense. But as far as the values of would the police department and the fire department work well under one structure, we didn't look at that. So there are a lot of things that the community needs to, if that was going to be seriously contemplated, those would have to be looked at as well, absolutely, because it's not just money, it's a lot more than just money. Correct. We're not. We hope to get some of their input on what we've presented already before the next meeting, but no, we're not. We haven't talked to them about.
I think I see what. Thank you. I just realized. I think there was a disconnect between what I thought you were asking and what I believe I now realize. Unlike the contracting discussion, nothing is contemplated to change in the fire department contract. There's no, we can't have the discussion about what the scenario would look like from a contracting perspective with El Cerrito, because what's contemplated is that there's no change in that situation. It would just, so that, there's no mystery there from my perspective, right? So that's not it, but it is, I mean, just ask yourself for a moment, and you can look at this from all different angles. LAFCO merges the two boards. Now, just sit with that for a moment and think about it in this community. That is a thing of opportunity. How you view about, because that would change the culture of both of both environments radically. So, good or bad, values-based discussion, right? And the rest of the discussion, the visualization of the future discussion, is filled with just issue after issue that's like that. So let's talk about that, and with the numbers being clear.
Yeah, I think one thing, though, that it's not just, we of course recognize sometimes occasionally disagree, it's not really just waving a wand. There's just dissolving the fire district, dealing with the potential fallouts of the contract, which hasn't been decided. So it isn't just waving a wand and all of a sudden there's one fairy dust magic unicorn district. You know, there's a lot of things in between. There's LAFCO talking to a lot of people. There's a year at least, I think, of a special review that has to be done before they even contemplate it. So it's a kind of a messy process. It involves a lot. So there's a lot to consider even before it happens, let alone what happens afterwards.
So people are hanging in. We'll take a few more. We'll have a few more minutes questions for those who are looking at the clock and do need to leave. Just as a reminder, we do have that short survey there, but we have time for some more questions. And you have the microphone. And you have the microphone. You guys want to flip?
May I go ahead?
Of course, go ahead.
All right. I think this is primarily a question directed towards Lisa, but it certainly relates to other things, and I appreciate your comments about values. I think that is really important for us to keep in mind. Can everybody hear me? Okay. The main thing that I was interested in, which seemed to go by very fast and without very much discussion, was a comment. I believe it came from you, but it was certainly in your area. It was a comment to the effect that everybody that you talked to was saying that bifurcation was desirable, and that was the preferred mode. But I don't think you explained to us what the reasoning and so on and the values behind that preference was. What was the general reason or multiple reasons for why bifurcation was considered desirable? I consider it desirable, but I'd like to know what the people that you consulted with thought were the important factors.
Great. Yeah, I think I had a caveat to that sentence saying that the three districts I talked to that had the chief and the dual position didn't necessarily agree with that, but all the other agencies we spoke with did. And it was primarily that if you have a general manager, they have a more global position, they have a bigger picture in their mind about the total community. These are things that came up. They have a different skill set that's focused in maybe some areas of specialty, but also kind of like looking at the total community as a whole, which they weren't sure that a dual position could do unless they had the special skill sets in that. And then, there was another thing that was just in my mind about this. That there was another level of oversight, that there's another person that oversees the police function, which is a major function in the community. So there's another voice, there's guidance perhaps, there's making sure community values are being upheld by the culture of the police department. And so everybody, those were the kinds of things that we kept hearing over and over. I hope that clarifies.
Thank you very much. That's helpful to me and maybe to other people.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Hi. My question is directed to the GMCOP committee.
Could you speak right into the microphone?
Closer? Is this better? Okay. Because we have not had a GM of the high caliber that exists in other towns, I would ask the committee to explore further the requirements, professional standards of this position. For example, by contacting the ICMA for additional information. I know I provided the brochure on this, and this is the association for professionals who are general managers or city managers in departments. And I just didn't hear enough information about the specialization in this field, the ethical standards. So I'd really like to see you explore that and point out the value of having someone with this high level of expertise and experience that, yes, you do pay a price for, because you are getting someone who does have an understanding on many levels of what the needs are of the community. Secondly, I just wanted to comment on something that you mentioned in the that there were difficulties of having a COP and a GM. They have to be able to get along. I just wanted to, from my research, and I'm Marilyn Stolen, the general manager is the one who hires the chief of police. So if he's not a match in values, in integrity, in honesty, in procedures, he goes or she goes, and the general manager then hires another person who is a better fit for the community. So I just wanted to make that very clear, that there is a progression. That person is at the top of the food chain, the general manager. And so the chief of police is not at the board meetings. The general manager is at the board meetings in that role. So that just didn't come across clearly.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, those are just a brief response. Those are good comments that the GM is responsible for hiring and the performance of the police chief. That's a good distinction. The issue of the ICMA, of course, Marilyn, we have all of your stuff, which we've read, and I think that's a good point that we can build upon, as we move forward, because we have all that. It's, the GM responsibilities are pretty clear in carrying out the policy of the board and some of the issues around that. They're an excellent source, and so we can include that as we move forward. Thanks.
Let me just add one thing, though. It depends on the size of the district. It isn't always a default that the general manager would hire the police chief. In a smaller district, it's quite common to have the board hire the police chief. So really, it is certainly I'm not trying to debate or argue with you, Marilyn. I'm just saying that, as Lisa pointed out, when we talk to a lot of these jurisdictions, large ones, small ones, and they looked at the services arrangement we have, it was unique in their sense. And so, they had this aha moment, well, maybe we can see why you have a GM, chief of police combined. They didn't necessarily agree that that was the best approach, as Lisa has pointed out in her slides. That almost universally, except for a couple police districts, everybody else told us the best way is having a bifurcated approach. And then how you do the hiring, but also more important, or as important, how you set up the process for all these other activities, grievances, discipline, investigations, and oversight is really what is critical. So, it's, I think
tiny little towns that you looked at, Stallion Springs and Viejo Rio, whatever they're called, those are very small, tiny towns that really are not comparable to us and in any level whatsoever, and I didn't even include them in the research because of that. But what I found was that that chain of command goes up, and because you have that chain of command with the general manager at the top, that person is able to be dispassionate about any issues that come up with personnel because they truly have no skin in the game. They are not supervising the administrative staff, and they are not supervising the police. And there really is a firewall. And and that person has always hired. So I really differ with you based on my research.
This is a value issue.
All I'm trying to indicate is what we found in our research, that's all. And I actually agree with a lot with what you're saying, Marilyn. When we talk about small districts, it was interesting, at least from my perspective, and maybe others on our committee, that some of these small districts had about 3 or 4 services that were important services, including police. They may have had supplied drinking water. They had to deal with their wastewater treatment, all those. So they had multiple services. So it's hard to just say because you're small, you don't compare with us. So, and I think we should have more of that discussion going forward. But in the bottom line, I tend to agree with what you're saying.
And we will save a front row spot for you on June 13th, sorry.
Yeah, June 13th, Maryland.
We'll
I'll
even bring the
reserve the
popcorn.
seat for you.
Okay, Simon, you have the microphone.
First of all, I want to thank everyone who attended. I'm sorry I wanted to have this message when there were more people here, but I really appreciate the dedication of those people who attended. There were a lot of things that were discussed, and I appreciate your willingness to be part of an active community. I think that's critical for Kensington as we move forward, that we have the involvement of the members of the community. So I want to thank you all very much.
Thank you. So I think this is a wrap, but we have to, we need a motion to adjourn the meeting.
So Simon so moves. Do I hear a second? Maybe all in favor of closing the meeting?
Aye.
And thank you all very much. And hopefully we'll
Great
be
job,
on the 13th for the first subcommittee.
Please fill out the surveys and help yourself to those scones.